Hey friends, back again. I decided to go ahead and just record a little bit more. Are you ready to keep reading? This is now part 5 of Module 9, beginning on page 273. The details of the fossil record, evidence against macroevolution. Ready? Well, if the geological column holds no real evidence for or against macroevolution, where must we look next? We can look the same place Darwin did. After examining the geological column, Darwin looked at the details of the fossil record. The study of the fossil record is called paleontology, and it provides strong evidence against macroevolution. Paleontology, the study of fossils. If macroevolution did occur, paleontologists should be able to find series of fossils that demonstrate how one species slowly evolved into another. If wild dogs, for example, did eventually give rise to horses, then there should be fossils of animals that are somewhere between a dog and a horse. Darwin called these life forms, which he assumed must have existed, intermediate varieties. Today we call them intermediate links or transitional forms because they represent a link or transition between one species and another. Unfortunately for Darwin, there were only a few examples of fossils that might be interpreted to be intermediate links. And even for those fossils, their status as intermediate links was quite questionable. This lack of intermediate links was the most vexing problem that Darwin had with his hypothesis. In fact, in his book, he stated, geological research, though it has added numerous species to existing and extinct genera, and has made the intervals between some few groups less wide than they otherwise would have been, yet has done scarcely anything in breaking the distinction between species by connecting them together with numerous, fine, intermediate varieties. And this not having been affected is probably the gravest and most obvious of all the many objections which can be raised against my views. Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species. Notice what he says here. Darwin's hypothesis says that one species eventually led to another. Thus, there should be, quote, fine intermediate varieties, end quote, of fossils in between species. The fact that there weren't was a problem that he called grave. Additionally, note that he admits that there are many objections which can be raised against his views. As we stated before, Darwin was very open about the flaws that he saw in his macroevolutionary hypothesis. In fact, he devoted many pages of his book to detailing the many objections which could be raised against his views. Although Darwin could not find any good examples of intermediate links in the fossil record, he had a hope. He figured that geology and paleontology were still in their infant stages. Therefore, they just hadn't found the intermediate links yet. He was convinced that as time went on, however, geologists and paleontologists would find them. Thus, he assumed that the intermediate links were currently just missing from the fossil record, but they would be found in time. Critics of macroevolution quickly coined the phrase missing link to emphasize that the fossil record was devoid of any evidence for macroevolution. Well, what of these missing links? Has paleontology uncovered them? The answer to that is an unequivocal no. Read, for example, the words of Dr. David Ropp, the curator of the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History and an expert on the fossil record. Well, we are now about 120 years after Darwin, and knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. David Ropp, Field Museum of Natural History Bulletin, 1979. So, Dr. Robb says that the missing links are still missing. Darwin saw this fact as strong evidence against macroevolution. And Dr. Robb says that the situation is worse now than ever. Since Dr. Robb's quote is more than 20 years old, you might wonder whether paleontology has discovered anything in the past 2 decades to make the situation any better for macroevolution. The answer is a clear and convincing no. Consider, for example, this summary of the state of paleontology in regard to macroevolution. According to Darwin, the fossil record should be rife with examples of transitional forms leading from the less to more evolved. Instead of filling the gaps in the fossil record with so called missing links, most paleontologists found themselves facing a situation in which there are only gaps in the fossil record, with no evidence of transformational intermediates between documented fossil species. Jeffrey H. Schwartz, Sudden Origins, 1999, 1999. In other words, Dr. Schwartz, a macroevolutionist, is admitting that instead of finding transitional forms, paleontologists find mostly gaps. Now, please understand that this flies in the face of what Darwin proposed. In fact, on the back cover of Dr. Schwartz's book, we read, quote, Darwin may have argued that new species emerge through a slow, gradual accumulation of tiny mutations. But the fossil record reveals a very different scenario: the sudden emergence of whole new species with no apparent immediate ancestors. End quote. Now, think about this for a minute. The hypothesis of macroevolution tries to explain something about Earth's past. Since no one was around back then to tell us whether or not macroevolution actually happened, it is necessary to look for data that either support or contradict the hypothesis. Well, if you're looking for data about Earth's history, where is the first place you would look? You look at the fossil record. What does the fossil record say? It says that macroevolution never happened. Do you see what we mean when we say that scientists don't believe in macroevolution today because of the evidence? If the fossil record, the main place you look for information about Earth's past, shows no evidence for macroevolution, scientists simply should not believe in it. At this point, you might be thinking, if the fossil record points so strongly against macroevolution, why do any scientists today believe in it? Well, there are a couple reasons. Some scientists are so committed to the idea of macroevolution that they've come up with special variations of macroevolution that attempt to explain around the fact that the fossil record does not support the idea. In fact, both Dr. Raup and Dr. Schwartz expose the lack of transitional forms in the fossil record, specifically to promote one of these variations, which is called punctuated equilibrium. In this variation, it is assumed that the transitional forms that link one species to another do not live for very long. As a result, there's not much chance of them fossilizing. We will discuss this idea in more depth later in this module. The second reason some scientists still cling to the hypothesis of macroevolution is that even though the fossil record has mostly gaps, there are some fossils that can be pointed to as possible transitional forms. Their status as transitional forms is highly questionable. But if you really need to believe in macroevolution, these fossils can give you at least some hope. Consider, for example, the very famous fossil of a creature called Archaeopteryx, which evolutionists want to believe is an intermediate link between reptiles and birds. This fossil is found in Jurassic rock, which, see figure 9.2, contains remains of dinosaurs as well. In the geological column, Jurassic rock is underneath Cretaceous rock, which is underneath Tertiary rock. Although a few fossilized birds are found in other strata, the vast majority of bird fossils in the fossil record come from either Tertiary rock or the Quaternary rock that lies on top of it. Now, remember, according to the assumptions of macroevolutionists, this would mean that birds did not really exist in significant numbers until the times during which the Tertiary and Quaternary rock formed. Thus, during the times when Cretaceous and Jurassic rock were forming, macroevolutionists assume that birds had not yet evolved to any significant degree. Since Archaeopteryx is found in Jurassic rock, macroevolutionists conclude that it lived prior to most birds and that it could therefore be one of the transitional forms linking birds to their common ancestor, which is assumed to be some form of reptile. The figure below shows you a picture of the fossil of Archaeopteryx, as well as an artist's rendition of what the creature might have looked like. In the vast majority of respects, this creature is a bird. The fossil shows very good imprints of feathers. An analysis of these feather imprints, let me begin again that sentence, a little fuzzy. The fossil shows very good imprints of feathers. An analysis of these feather imprints indicates that they are the kinds of feathers you see on birds that are living today. In fact, flightless birds that are living today have different feathers from those of birds that fly. And the fossil imprints indicate that Archaeopteryx had feathers of a flying bird. In addition, the bones preserved in the fossil are very similar to the bones of birds that are living today. The skull, for example, shows that Archaeopteryx had a brain very similar to flying birds that are living today, and the fossilized inner ear indicates that Archaeopteryx had senses of hearing and balance that are comparable to flying birds that are living today. After performing X-ray scans of the skull and working with computer models, Dr. Timothy Rowe of the University of Texas at Austin said, quote, "This animal had huge eyes and a huge vision region in its brain to go along with that, and a great sense of balance. Its inner ear also looks very much like the ear of a modern bird. End quote. In addition, paleontologists have been able to confirm bone structures that indicate Archaeopteryx had the same kind of lung design that birds living today have. In the end, then, Archaeopteryx seems to be a bird. Why do many paleontologists consider Archaeopteryx a transitional form between reptile and bird? Because Archaeopteryx has teeth, which birds living today do not have, and it has claws on its wings, as shown on the illustration in the figure. No adult bird living today has claws on its wings. Some young birds, like the juvenile turaco or the juvenile hoatzin, have claws on their wings when they are young, but they lose them by the time that they're adults. Some adult birds, like the ostrich, have structures on their wings that a few texts call claws, but they are better called spurs because they do not have the actual structure of claws. Because of these minor differences between Archaeopteryx and birds living today, macroevolutionists want to believe it is a transitional form between bird and reptile. After all, most but not all reptiles have teeth, and most but not all reptiles have front and back claws. Thus, the teeth in Archaeopteryx are supposed to represent reptilian teeth that had not quite evolved away. And the claws on its wings are supposed to represent front reptilian claws that had not quite blended in to the wing. There are at least two problems with this interpretation. First, it assumes that birds living today are the only representations of proper birds. This is a rather myopic view of the natural world. We have many fossils that tell us a lot about the kinds of creatures that lived on this earth but are not living now. Are we to ignore them? If we do not ignore these creatures, we find that there were other birds that had teeth. In fact, there is a whole subclass devoted to such extinct birds. Subclass Odontornithes. I got it right. Odontornithes. Subclass Odontornithes. As a result, it is not clear that the teeth on Archaeopteryx are all that special. The second problem with this interpretation is that it puts a lot of emphasis on rather minor structures in the animal. Based on its feathers, bone structure, lung structure, etc., Archaeopteryx seems to be a true bird. These are the main features we look at to determine whether or not something is a bird. To concentrate on two minor features, one of which exists in extinct birds, seems to be ignoring the vast majority of the data. Those who want to believe that Archaeopteryx is a transitional form will counter that we only see these structures in extinct birds, and therefore it is reasonable to assume that they were part of the evolutionary process. However, species go extinct rather regularly, as demonstrated by the fossil record itself. The fact that all of the birds with these characteristics are now extinct is not surprising, since extinction is a major part of the fossil record. Archaeopteryx at least illustrates how difficult it is for macroevolutionists to come up with transitional forms in the fossil record. If Archaeopteryx is a transitional form, it is a very late one. It must have been one of the very last creatures on the hypothetical macroevolutionary line between reptile and bird. Of all the transitional forms necessary to turn a reptile into a bird, it seems odd that the only one that has been found is so incredibly bird like. Why isn't there a transitional form that is not so ambiguous? As we said before, there are a few fossils like Archaeopteryx that macroevolutionists can present as transitional forms. The problem is, like Archaeopteryx, let me begin again and get a sip of water. Hold on. Excuse me. The problem is, like Archaeopteryx, these supposed transitional forms are incredibly similar to one of the two types of creatures they're supposed to be linking. It seems much safer to conclude that these are just specialized versions of the creatures they're similar to, as opposed to transitional forms between two different kinds of creatures. Let's pause there for now. I'll meet you again at the top of page 278 next time. All right, friends. See you later. Bye bye.